because today I'll be showing some published and polished results. There's a dark side to the moon. TDCS is a little bit of a controversial technique these days. Partly because the research myth that TDCS hasn't been around for too long, or the resurgence of TDCS hasn't been too long. So the methods we use in, like, starting about 10 years ago, haven't been as elaborate as for TMS, for example, where we have requirements for control sites, for task control. This is lacking pretty much in TDCS. So I will present a lot of older work, just to tell you a nice story about what we're doing, that may incorporate some studies that we've done, possibly now, but still. So I thought I should start out with giving you an overview of what my lab has been doing in the last 6 or 7 years in Australia. And pretty much this is a continuation of what we've been doing in Berlin in the United States, and before that in Germany. Okay. Good. Okay. I'll go down at some stage, just wave at me. So, the typical progression of the research in my lab is always that we start out with healthy young individuals, then look at effects that are due to neural reorganization in aging, and then potentially we progress to age-associated pathologies like stroke, dementia, Parkinson's disease more recently. We're using typical behavioral experiments in cross-sectional settings. We're using brain stimulation techniques, brain imaging techniques, but also training and intervention studies, as well as prospective studies, longitudinal studies. I started out as a rehabilitation researcher during my Ph.D. and was gradually incorporating the imaging and brain stimulation components to our research. And I think most of the early research I'm known for is in the language domain in stroke patients. And only in the last 7 or 8 years I kind of turned myself more into a cognitive neuroscientist, partly because access to patients is quite difficult in Australia. But we're not only doing research on language. We have a large research area on social cognition, executive functions, memory, learning, and motor function more recently. And then in this part of our research agenda, we're slowly progressing from lab-based experiments to more functionally relevant outcome measures. In patient populations, we're looking at health economic issues, and in the future, the lab-based training studies will be translated into other types of settings, like internet home-based trainings. So this is all in the flow at the moment. Good. All right. Within this research agenda, one major focus has been on TDCS. And I thought I should give you a brief overview of what TDCS is. What you see here is a typical TDCS setup. There are 2 electrodes attached to the scalp, and there's a weak constant or direct current that's projected between an active and a reference or return electrode. And the current travels through the scalp, the bony structures, to the brain, and is received here. What's important to know about TDCS is that, very much unlike TMS, it's a neuromodulatory technique. It does not induce action potentials. And basically
simply modulates the threshold that's required for neural functioning. I'll come back to that on the next slide. But it's also important that whatever we do with TDCS requires ongoing brain activity. So the stimulation interacts with what's happening during the stimulation or shortly afterwards in terms of brain activity. It's a safe technique. There are basically no major adverse effects in tens of thousands of participants and patient populations. So that's a good thing. TMS had some severe adverse effects. There have been none with TDCS so far. At least there were none reported. Those are the two main types of TDCS. One is called anodal TDCS, and that's an excitatory type of stimulation. And what it presumably does is increases cortical excitability, thereby reducing the threshold that's required for neural excitation. It makes it easier for neurons to get active. And cathodial TDCS is basically the opposite. It's an inhibitory type of stimulation where we reduce cortical excitability, making it more unlikely that neurons will become active. What's also important, there are different, depending on the duration and the frequency of stimulation, the effects may differ completely in terms of how long they last. If we stimulate the brain for a short period of time, like 20 minutes would be a typical experimental session, the effects of the stimulation on neural populations will outlast the end of the stimulation only for a very brief time, like 30 to 90 minutes approximately, depending on the intensity and duration. And I would call this the proof of concept stage, because what it means, we can basically test out if a specific montage, a specific arrangement of electrodes interacts in a positive or negative way with a given task. On the other hand, if we stimulate multiple times, like say 5 consecutive days for 20 minutes, and combine that with training, a learning experience, or a given treatment in patient populations, has been shown that those effects, positive or negative, may outlast the end of the stimulation's duration for up to 1 year. So this is a much more permanent type of application. There are different montages. That's the classical montage, where we have 2 relatively large electrodes that result in very diffuse stimulation. Like the current travels from here to there, and on the next slide I show you some simulations of current flow in the brain, and you'll see it's all over the place. There are more modern setups, like this one here, where the current goes into the brain at a small center anode and gets picked up by either a bunch of surrounding electrodes or a ring electrode. And this arrangement supposedly constrains the current flow to more focal or local areas. And this is from publication of one of my postdocs, slightly adapted, basically showing in yellowish colors the intensity of the current in the brain. This is not measured, this is a computer simulation based on real MRI images. And you can see this is the large conventional electrode and reference electrode. You can see it's fairly focal underneath the electrode, but also quite a bit of current flow to the rest of the brain. Well, this setup, where we have a small center electrode, in this case a ring that surrounds it, it's much more focal in this case to the inferior parietal lobe. Another advantage of TDCS is that we can use it during functional imaging, either EEG, MIG, but also fMRI. So we can directly visualize or measure the interaction between a given stimulation and ongoing brain activity. And that's one of the techniques we've used quite a bit in the past. The other advantage is we can use these images for realistic modeling of the current simulations. We can also verify that we've actually stimulated the target region, because you can see the electrode and then zoom in, and then you know exactly where those have been attached. Good. I hope this has given you a little bit of an idea about the technique I'm going to be talking about. And the easiest way for me to present on TDCS and our own stuff is to talk about language processing. And in 2012, we've published our first intra-gamma TDCS study. So essentially what we've done, we had 20 healthy young subjects, and they performed a semantic fluency task. So they saw categories, different categories, animals, musical instruments, whatsoever, and they saw those categories on a screen in the scanner, and they were asked to produce examples. For animals, it would be wombat, kangaroo, dolphin, manatee, whatever. So, and we stimulated the left inferior frontal gyrus with the conventional TDCS setup. A relatively large sponge electrode attached over the inferior frontal gyrus. So this had been trialed behaviorally, and there were some beneficial effects on language processing after IFG stimulation. And behaviorally, we found the same pattern. And this was a crossover design, meaning, and that's basically in all our short-term studies, we use crossover designs where subjects come in twice, and the first time they may receive active stimulation, and the second time a placebo stimulation. And typically 50% of the participants receive the reverse order. So behaviorally, active stimulation ATDCS improved performance, indicated by reduced number of errors during the task. That was significant. And with regard to task-related imaging, what we saw here was, or what we investigated in this case, was a very specific effect. We're interested about the local specificity of potential effects on the brain. So what we know is that the ventral portion of the IFG is a very important region for word retrieval, for the retrieval component from semantic memory. For the dorsal component here, more important for phonological retrieval. And what we see here is a very specific and isolated effect that is expressed as reduced metabolic activity in the ventral semantic portion of the IFG. This might be a little counterintuitive because we're using an excitatory stimulation and we see reduced metabolic activity in the brain. Does anyone find this curious? Any explanations? Tentative?
Based on the behavior, we say that maybe more activity leads to more errors and less constraints.
Well, it could be. They make more errors and they show, well, this has actually been shown. We've shown that increased activity is usually associated with more errors. Well, there's a lot of possible explanations for this pattern. It can make sense, but I don't think it's the real answer to what's happening. I think it's an epiphenomenon, because we also looked at connectivity within the brain. And when you look at the direct comparison between active versus placebo stimulation, you see all these yellowish areas, including the stimulation site, the left IFG, homolog areas, left insula, premotor cortex, middle temporal gyrus, inferior parietal gyrus, they show enhanced communication with each other. And if you know anything about language, you see that this is a classical network that would show up during language processing, especially expressive language processing. So these regions seem to communicate better with each other, which possibly reduces the retrieval effort in the prefrontal cortex. That might be one explanation. So the next step for us, and that's keeping with the pattern jumping from young to old, we were looking at healthy older participants. And this slide actually shows one of the main disadvantages of TDCS, expressed as we only got permission from elderly gentlemen to show their pictures. Imagine you get wet sponges attached to your head or an adhesive paste for the high definition setups. You better take a shower afterwards. The ladies wouldn't allow us to show their pictures, which is a shame. They look good. Anyway, the reason to continue with this research on semantic fluency is very simple, and it was based on some really old studies from Germany. That was actually my first functional imaging study, I think, outside of strong populations, and a follow-up study in the States. And in both studies, we asked healthy young and healthy older people to perform two overt semantic and phonemic fluency tasks. Semantic, and I've explained, phonemic means say T, and you have to come up with a lot of words starting with T. So, when you look at the activity patterns across cultures, native English, native German speakers, the young population show a very strong left dominant prefrontal activity pattern. And curiously, in the older subjects, we see a much more bilateral pattern. And this is not language specific. It's a pattern you see in the motor domain, for memory retrieval, in coding. Older people frequently show a less lateralized pattern. We don't know exactly where it comes from, and I don't think anyone has been able to explain exactly what happens. But this is pretty consistent across languages and across tasks. It's also not beneficial, because here you see some correlations, and that has been replicated in our lab 4 times. The more of this pattern individual participants have, the worse they perform. So it's not something that helps them to compensate for potential grey matter, white matter atrophy, inefficient networks, neurometabolic or neurotransmitter changes. It's simply a bad pattern to have. So, in the next step, we replicated exactly the study we ran with the young participants. And what you see here is the behavioral performance of the young participants from the previous study, and the behavioral pattern of the older participants during placebo stimulation. So, what this shows is more pronounced errors in our older people, which is pretty consistent with the literature. Older people usually perform worse than young people on this task. And when we look at brain activity, then we see an upregulation in the left inferior frontal cortex, but also in the right homologue and in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, basically replicating those two studies from Germany and from the States. When we stimulate the older people, performance improves, and this upregulation in brain activity in those 3 regions that show hyperactivity during placebo stimulation goes down, and is no longer different behaviorally and in the brain compared to the young individuals. So this is the task active regions. When we look at connectivity between brain regions, we see a very typical pattern when we compare older people with young people regarding their network structure. So this is a direct comparison between young and older people in yellowish colors, most pronounced in the lateral and medial frontal cortex. We see hyperconnectivity, more communication with other brain regions in older people. And in blue you see here, those are regions where young people have more connectivity than older people. When we stimulate our older participants and then compare the data to the young group, that's the bottom slide, you see that those network differences between the age groups are drastically reduced. So we temporarily reconfigure the network structure in a way that our older people seem to be rejuvenated. We didn't get it published with that title.
The original title for this submission was Rejuvenating the Aging Mind, which didn't fly with the editor or the reviewers.
So that's a very boring title now, very descriptive. They also asked us to add the word temporarily, which is true, because about at most 90 minutes after our participants had left the scanner, everything was back to normal, which is a shame. But in the end, it's a very nice proof of concept study. So, we continued to the next stage, where we looked at patients with amnestic MCI. Neuropsychologically, those patients have memory problems. They're not very pronounced, but they're measurable. Here in the verbal domain and visual memory are impaired compared to matched healthy controls. But they also have a very selective impairment of semantic word retrieval, semantic verbal fluency. It's part of the clinical spectrum of those patients. When we stimulate, or when we compare performance in the scanner of those patients in black with those of healthy age-matched controls, they perform even worse. When we stimulate them, performance improves, and at least statistically they're no more different from the older people. When we look at the brain, we see hyperactivity in bilateral prefrontal cortices, in this case including the dorsal AFG, and normalization and reduction and normalization compared to healthy controls. And this is a messy slide, but also illustrating reconfiguration, short-term reconfiguration of network and normalization towards the patterns of healthy older controls. So even in those prodromal cases of Alzheimer's or MCI patients, not all of them will develop Alzheimer's disease, but they have a pretty good chance. We can temporarily change their network configuration during task-related fMRI and task-absent resting state fMRI. So, all these effects are short-term. So the next step for us was to look into longer-lasting effects of TDCS using multi-session TDCS. The first study we published in this area was a language learning study based on Mylène's Finnish farm tools. So the task of our subjects, and that's healthy young people, was to associate a total of 170 images of Finnish farm tools and like 50% normal objects like balls, trees, whatever, with non-word names. So they were exposed to those 140 combinations twice a day over 5 consecutive days, and it was a very simple study where we ran an active stimulation administered to the inferior parietal cortex, important for language learning, and versus a placebo stimulation condition. So you would be surprised. What do you think was the maximum of learned associations in our group? Like the main outcome measure was to type the exact name of those objects on a computer. 140 pairings, 8 exposures. How many trials? 140 times 8 exposures. Hold on, 10. 80%. We had 4 people who were at 100% after 3 days. Medical students who just completed the anatomy exam. Highly trained to associate random names with structures. Anyway, so the main outcome is very simple to report. Anodal TDCS improved learning ability, not by much, that's about, well, if you express it in percent, it's actually quite pronounced, but in the end, learning curves were steeper and maintained a week later. A very simple study from 2014, actually we started that in 2012, took a while. In Queensland, we just completed a much more elaborate study. This is one of my Ph.D. students who just graduated, by the way, Garen Percival. And what we did was this study. It's a language learning study that involved 60 healthy older adults. And they had to learn associations between space aliens. And those space aliens had a name and 2 semantic attributes. The primary outcome, again, was they saw those space aliens and they had to type the name, and then there were forced choice decision tasks, button press, to decide about names and attributes.
The elaborate part of the study is that we not only looked at learning curves, but we also differentiated between online and offline effects. What does that mean?
I told you that the stimulation effect lasts about 30 to 90 minutes. So, if you let them go through a learning phase where they get exposed to those space aliens, their attributes and names, and you test them immediately afterwards, they will still be under the influence of the stimulation. The next morning, this has worn off. And the reason we've done that was that in 2009 there was a PNAS paper published by Janine Rice, who looked at motor learning. And that paper has never been replicated nor extended into cognitive learning, showed that the TDCS effect was specifically mediated by an effect on overnight consolidation. There was no effect on online learning during this motor task, but a very pronounced effect the next morning. So that was kind of replicated by Fritsch in 2013, I believe, and they claimed it's not overnight learning, but it's time that passed, like 6 hours. So, very similar result. What we did, we looked at the learning curves, and we do get a significant effect, but it's quite small. And there's no effect or no specific effect on overnight learning in our data. So what you see here, those curves, like it goes up after the learning phase and then it goes down the next morning, goes up. So it's a nice staircase pattern. And this is the main outcome variable, significant, more pronounced learning for anodal TDCS, completely independent of overnight consolidation. In the end, they benefit from TDCS after the training, and this effect is maintained. the catch in this study is there's a huge literature by now on subpopulations that respond particularly well to TDCS. And of course, subpopulations have different brain organization. What we were interested in is baseline learning ability. There are subgroups of older people who learn really well as healthy young people. And then there's a subgroup of people who don't learn very well, potentially those that drift into a dementia process at some stage. So we looked at the effect of baseline learning. We had included a short version of this learning paradigm prior to the actual experiment, and then classified, and it was a continuous variable for the analysis, but here this just depicts the categorical split between high and low performers. And you can see the high learners show no effect at all in terms of TDCS effects. They learn quite well, but there's no TDCS effect at all. Well, in those low learners, if you express it in percentage, it's a 75% gain in learning ability, which is quite drastic. So, there's a catch to that as well. If you look at the stimulation or the learning curves for the low learners and the high learners, it becomes pretty much obvious that we can improve quite a bit, but we don't get them up to the level of the high learners. There's still quite a bit of a deficit. So this is not a pill you give and make the older people all of a sudden turn them into super learners. It's a good effect, but the difference is still quite pronounced. And if we look at the young data, this is the learning curves for the young group. The outcomes is almost exactly the same as for the high learners in the old group. There's no stimulation effect at all. So there must be, we didn't include an imaging component. We didn't have any imaging information about learning related activity on networks, but that would actually be of interest to document the interaction between the current in the different populations. So this would probably be the next step in terms of identifying subgroups and explaining why these things work in those low learning older people. So this has been mostly healthy populations. I just want to give you some examples about pathological aging conditions. So this is some MRI images of stroke patients. And here patient 1 has a lesion in this area, well, fairly small. There's a larger lesion, all in the left hemisphere, and this is mostly white matter, insular lesions in the third patients. All those patients have aphasia, language impairment after stroke. When we look at activity patterns elicited by a naming task, a very frequently used task in aphasia research, you see that the lesion obviously changes the way language is processed in the brain, and that's a highly individual process. This is the same task, and performance is identical in those two patients, but this performance is basically supported by different networks in the brain. So, what about stimulating stroke patients' brains? It's a very different thing, because when you look at TDCS studies in healthy individuals, there's one assumption that TDCS or TMS has common with functional imaging. It assumes that all brains work very similar. So we can stimulate the same brain regions in all participants. And this is true to some extent. There's quite a bit of variability between subjects, but that's basically treated as error. In the worst case scenario, you just need a few more participants for the averaging. But this doesn't work for stroke patients anymore. Like the most simple problem that happens is you may stimulate over the lesion. The lesion changes the way the current flows through the brain. So what we can do, and this is a proof of concept study involving the reason I'm now back in Germany, we can visualize the reorganized brain network in individual patients, and then we can target these regions quite precisely. So this is an image of the actual electrode highlighted by the white rectangle, and then zoomed in, we can see that the electrode is directly over the target region that was identified in a pre-stimulation scan. We can also, even on a single case basis, and even though fMRI single subject data is quite unreliable, we can visualize the change from active to placebo stimulation, in this case an increase in the IFG. We have no idea what this means. We don't know, well, it would require very elaborate experimental designs to learn about the specific process that's happening here. We didn't do that. It was a technical report showing that we're able to stimulate specific regions on an individual basis. But it's a very expensive process, requires a lot of technical expertise, and in my opinion, it's quite useless. So, from a clinical perspective, we can't do that. It cost me about $8,000 to get those images up. Not counting the labor. So we were looking for a more pragmatic and feasible approach. And that brings me to one of my most favorite studies. It was published in 2011. And there was a lot of talk about embodied cognition, motor and language interactions. And we ran a very rudimentary study where we asked stroke patients with aphasia to name pictures. We had matched pictures, matched for individual difficulty. They had those goggles on, and they were naming those pictures while they were sitting. Not much activity in the leg motor cortex or in the motor cortex in general, and while they were standing. And my first guess was, you make people who may also have some motor impairment stand up and name pictures. That's not going to work. But interestingly, across a number of control tasks, the only effect we were getting was improved picture naming while standing. It's probably also one of the reasons I like to walk around during talks. Helps me with the language, especially as a non-native speaker. So, we followed up with a stimulation study. The hope was that by stimulating the primary motor cortex, in this case in elderly people, we would be able to facilitate language processing. And indeed, verbal fluency performance improved during active motor cortex stimulation in healthy older adults. And then we went further. We looked at a stroke population. And this was, I think it was 18 or 20, but no, it was 16 patients with chronic language impairment after stroke. This is a heat map of the lesion. The better it is, the more patients had a lesion in this area. That's a problem for imaging, because imaging again assumes that we have similar representations of the task in the brain. So when we directly compared active and sham stimulation, it's not surprising that we only found an effect, in this case reduced activity, in the anterior cingulate cortex and the left insula. during active stimulation. Those regions were not lesioned in any of our participants or patients, and those regions are responsible for cognitive control. So apparently, and this was actually a language naming task, where we pre-selected items that all the patients could name properly and as fast as quickly. Massive study, actually. So there was like no behavioral difference between active and sham, but still we see that like this could be an indicator that even in the absence of a performance defect, it was easier for the brain to come up with a task. And this was kind of confirmed in a subsequent, quite elegant analysis where we looked at functional networks. Told you, when there's lesion overlap in the brain, certain read and language reorganization, we have a problem with imaging, because patients may show effects in different parts of the residual network. So what we did on a group level, we identified task-related networks that were positively correlated with the task, negatively correlated with a control condition, and that gave us 3 networks: a bilateral motor network, visual network, and a relatively large left dominant language network, including anterior and posterior sites. When we look at changes in activity within those 3 networks, and we did that on purpose, we didn't need to identify the specific site of change, because in those reorganized brains, we have 16 different regions may contribute to change. So this is an elegant way to looking at large changes within networks. The only thing we saw was increased activity on average across the patients in the language component. There was nothing in the motor component, nothing in the visual component. When we looked further and looked at something that's called a spectral ACA, so the fMRI signal is made up of specific frequencies, high or lower frequencies, and you can isolate them. What we also saw is an increase during active stimulation in lower frequency bands and a reduction in higher frequency bands. When you look at the schizophrenia literature, typically this pattern is observed when participants get an increase in lower frequency bands is indicative of better communication within a specific network, in this case, the language component. So across all patients, this might signal an increase in within language network communication, irrespective of the sites in individual participants. So now you're confused, I assume. I would be. Anyway, so the next step here, and that's the last study I'm showing, was a small clinical trial where we stimulated the motor cortex during treatment. A single center trial, 2 weeks of daily speech and language therapy for 3 hours. That's what people do in chronic language impairment. A lot of treatment, massed treatment. TCS twice daily for 20 minutes. And what's really nice about this study is that we not only looked at trained items, that's what people typically do in these studies, we looked at transfer effects to untrained items and proxy measures of everyday communication, which is generalization. We also had a long-term maintenance window of 6 months. So I won't bother with individual outcomes, but I can see this would be trained items, untrained items, pre-pulse, pre-follow-up, and those are the everyday communication indicators. And you can see all of those improve, specifically in the long term, after 6 months, which was driven by the sham group losing much more of what they had acquired. Now, if you look at the effect sizes here, they're not trivial. So this is not a small effect we're talking about. So in this cohort, this worked really well across the measures. We've just received about 2 million Canadian dollars in funding to run a multi-center trial in Germany, which will happen at 16 centers. And it will be incorporated into the clinical routine. So this is actually the accumulation of this kind of research. Yes. So, thank you. So, maybe just one more minute as honorary mentions, because they both have left my lab, which will cease to exist on May 9th. At the moment I'm being paid by 2 countries, which is good. This is a Ph.D. student who just accepted a position in the States, and one of our collaborators in Germany, a famous professor, a good friend of mine. So what we're looking here is TDCS effects across different sites, in this case 4 sites, looking at regional specificity of high definition TDCS. We also have wonderful data for both setups in highly controlled intrascanner setups, so we can bring those high definition setups in the scanner, and we're just looking at the data on the 72 individuals. And this is the last one I'm showing because I love this. Andrew Martin is a postdoc now at the University of Durham, looking for a job. If you're interested in an exceptional young neuroscientist, it's just published a really cool paper in cerebral cortex where we look at regional but also task-specific effects of high-definition TDCS. Also have data on age and sex differences, cultural differences. We wanted to get into the Australian newspapers. Comparing Asians and Caucasians, immigration is a big thing. It turned out we can make Australians more Asian. It's not the other way around. So modeling, next step will be imaging for him. It's really nice work, and he's looking for a job. Have I mentioned this? Cool, thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Any questions?
Thank you for this presentation. It was very, very interesting. I have a very stupid question.
Stupid question.
I noted that I'm interested in your Flint's data because fluency is one of the earliest markers in the Bordeaux study. We found that I think that it was up to 12 years prior to dementia. It was starting to have problems with fluency. So it's not something that it's an interesting measure. But I noted you use errors in all your studies.
We're using what?
You use errors.
Errors, yes.
Number of errors, and I was surprised. I was curious to know how you define the errors. I suppose that it's perhaps when people mention a word that is not part of the category. But I wanted to know.
I could have displayed correct responses as well, but the bars look smaller and the effect looks nicer.
Okay. Because I was wondering if there was something special about errors,
No.
because it's intuitive in a way.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah. That's just the way we did it back in the day. And errors means omissions, incorrect category members,
Okay,
and so on.
incorrect
So it's a mix.
Incorrect category. Yes, yes.
Yes, but also
That's
omissions
but
and
we don't see that often. Usually,
yeah.
it's usually people who stick to the category because they
remember the
Yes,
structure.
they only name less than what is
Yes,
expected,
yes.
but not.
So I was curious because
Mm.
it might reflect in the literary problems, but maybe.
Okay. It was just consistent across studies, and we started with errors.
Thank you for the talk. Very interesting results. I'm not doing TCS. I've also a naive question. On the practical side of things, if we were to integrate this to clinical practice,
Mm.
can you elaborate a bit on A, generalization, and B, on the duration?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have to bring the patients in again, and in how many months or weeks after?
Again.
If you want the effect to endure in time.
Well, typically, like the RISE study trained the healthy individuals for 5 consecutive days. And I think the follow-up was 6 or 9 months, I believe. In our case, it was 2 weeks of daily training, but that's just the minimum number of training hours that are currently recommended for these naming paradigms in aphasia patients. In the end, what you want to have is a behavioral effect you want to boost. Like TDCS doesn't do much by itself, it just interacts in those training intervention paradigms with the normal neuroplastic processes. And you won't be able to improve patients who don't respond to the training itself. It's not like an ineffective training will all of a sudden become effective. So you need whatever patient population you're interested in, you need to have an effective intervention, and that can be days, weeks, or months. I don't know. Depends on the population and their impairment or disability or whatever. And then you need to choose a process or a stimulation site you assume that would be important, and then you would have to try it out. But I don't think there are recommendations for minimum durations at the moment. Like the longest or the shortest multi-session study I know of where they showed some questionable long-term effects has been 3 days, but that was experimental in healthy individuals. So it's difficult to say. There are very few multi-session studies around.
Thank you for the nice talk. In a clinical context, would you say that TDCS with aphasia patients would make them reach the level that they would normally attain faster, or would we give them the same time of treatment with TDCS and then have them reach a higher level?
Well, in our study, the maintenance was affected. The initial learning curves for the primary outcome measure were identical. There were no immediate effects, but the placebo group did not maintain as well. There are other studies showing immediate effects that were maintained, and some it goes down. This is we've been quite lucky with our language studies so far. To be honest, in other domains, we get isolated effects in younger and older populations, but not the consistent pattern we see as in those studies. And that's across the board. There's a lot of within group variability. People are starting to do individualized modeling. And when I started, I approached a few engineers about the modeling component, because if you want to do it in an individual manner using individual MRI data, it's quite challenging. And when I saw the first individual data, I was quite shocked. Like the simulations showed drastic variability of the amount and the distribution of the current that reaches individual brains, and then there are like things we can't even account for, like fatty hair is pretty bad for electrical conductivity. Bald people, where the skin is exposed to the elements a lot, have a much thicker protective layer of fat which may insulate. So we can't account for that in the modeling. And then there are like user errors, like if you don't do it in the scanner, you can't really verify where you've stimulated. So there's a lot of room for error, and I wouldn't, like, my approach at the moment is to test it out. And that's what the proof of concept stages are good for. You can, for a specific population, you can test out to get some idea what might happen in multi-session studies. But then there different networks are engaged in training and short-term crossover studies. But you may still learn about which networks are affected using the crossover designs. But it's quite difficult, and TDCS is being portrayed as a very simple to use technique, which it is not.
Thank you, Marcus. Alors, on a une pause de 10 minutes.
Okay. I hate talking into microphones.
No, it's really clear and very, it's like a course, very clear. You started from the first experiment, rational, very good.
Good. Okay. Makes me happy.
Ça Mathieu? Oui. Salut. C'est un petit peu... Oui, intégré dans tes... Ouais. Oui, tonton. Ça, c'est pour la souris, hein, c'est ça? Ah ouais, plus pour le pointeur. Un petit peu... Ouais, comme ça.
Les PDF, tout le monde, faut que je change mon truc.
Ah, ok. On va juste transférer le...
Les autres, tu les as tous?
Sylvie va... Inés va utiliser son portable. Okay. Sylvie aussi. Okay. J'ai celui de Véronique. Et j'ai eu de Louis aussi. Ok. Ok, c'est supposé être dedans.
Oui. C'est comme un couteau suisse, ton affaire.
Ouais. Ben, j'ai beaucoup de clés, mais c'est vraiment une façon pratique de toutes les avoir.
Toujours,
c'est plus compact. C'est laquelle? Exercice présentation. Ouais.
Moi, j'ai toujours l'inquiétude d'un effet de potentialisation de l'effet placebo.
Mais moi, j'étais en train de préparer, mais
il y a une dissociation.
Mais la stimulation cérébrale, j'ai beaucoup de misère, là, justement à cause que j'ai eu des mauvaises expériences avec. Puis j'ai regardé ces échantillons, j'ai regardé maintenant ces effets d'imagerie cérébrale, j'étais comme je sais pas, tu sais. Mais j'ai pas eu le temps de tout suivre.